February 14th, 1965, 2:47 in the morning. Malcolm X sits alone in his study in East Elmhurst, Queens, a Browning high-power pistol within arm's reach on his mahogany desk. Outside, 3 men in dark coats circle his house like vultures, their breath forming clouds in the bitter winter air. What Malcolm doesn't know yet is that in exactly 19 days, he'll be dead. But what those 3 men circling his house don't know is that across town in Harlem, an old man with tired eyes and silver hair is about to make a phone call that will change everything. The phone rings once, twice. On the 3rd ring, a gravelly voice answers. "Yeah, it's me," says the old man. "We got a problem." That old man is Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the most feared gangster in Harlem's history. The problem he's calling about will test a friendship that most people didn't even know existed. And the solution he's about to propose will save one of America's most important voices from being silenced forever. See, what you have to understand about February 1965 is that Malcolm X was living on borrowed time. After his explosive break from the Nation of Islam the year before, he'd become a marked man, not just by street thugs or random extremists, but by an organization with tentacles reaching into every major city in America, with soldiers who viewed killing as a religious duty and betrayal as the ultimate sin. Malcolm had crossed a line you don't cross. He'd called out Elijah Muhammad, the man his followers called the messenger of Allah, exposing his affairs, his corruption, his hypocrisy. In the twisted theology of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X had committed the unforgivable sin. He had to die. But here's what makes this story different from everything you think you know about Malcolm X's final days. The most dangerous threat to his life wasn't coming from the Nation of Islam's official leadership. It was coming from a rogue cell of true believers who'd decided the organization was moving too slowly, being too cautious. These weren't the disciplined soldiers Elijah Muhammad preferred. These were fanatics who believed God himself was commanding them to act. Their leader was a man named Thomas Hagen, though he went by the name Talmadge X. Hayer on the streets. Cold eyes, steady hands, a man who could put 3 bullets in a target from 30 yards and walk away like he'd just bought a newspaper. But what made Hagen truly dangerous wasn't his skill with a gun. It was his absolute conviction that killing Malcolm X would earn him a place in paradise. For months, Hagen and his crew had been watching Malcolm's every move. They knew he ate breakfast at the same diner on Amsterdam Avenue every Tuesday. They knew he stopped at the barbershop on 125th Street every other Friday. They knew his wife Betty was pregnant with twins, and that stress was eating him alive from the inside out. What they didn't know was that every move they made, every meeting they held, every plan they hatched was being watched by someone else entirely. Bumpy Johnson had built his empire on information. In a world where knowing something 5 minutes before your enemies could mean the difference between wealth and poverty, between freedom and prison, between life and death, Bumpy had cultivated sources everywhere. Bellhops in fancy hotels, cleaning ladies in government buildings, bartenders who served drinks to men who thought whiskey made them invincible and anonymous. One of those sources was a 19-year-old kid named Jerome, who worked the night shift at a diner on Malcolm X Boulevard. Jerome had grown up 3 blocks from where Bumpy lived, and like half the young men in Harlem, he both feared and idolized the old gangster. When Jerome heard 3 men at a corner booth talking about handling the preacher problem and mentioning dates and times and weapons, he knew exactly who needed to hear about it. That's how Bumpy Johnson, a man who'd spent his entire life on the opposite side of the law from everything Malcolm X represented, became the only thing standing between America's most important civil rights leader and a bullet with his name on it. You see, Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X had history. Not the kind you'd expect, but history nonetheless. Back in 1946, when Malcolm was still Malcolm Little and serving an 8-year sentence in Charlestown State Prison for burglary, Bumpy was already a legend on the streets. Word traveled fast in those days about the young con who was reading everything he could get his hands on, educating himself, transforming himself from a street hustler into something else entirely. When Malcolm got out in 1952 and joined the Nation of Islam, their paths crossed for the first time at a barbershop in Harlem. Malcolm, now Malcolm X, was there to preach. Bumpy was there for his weekly trim. What happened next would surprise everyone who knew both men. They talked for 3 hours. Not about crime or religion or politics, but about power, about respect, about what it meant to be a black man in America who refused to bow down. Malcolm saw in Bumpy a man who'd carved out his own kingdom in a world designed to crush him. Bumpy saw in Malcolm a different kind of fighter, someone who used words as weapons instead of guns, but with the same deadly precision. They didn't become friends exactly. Their worlds were too different for that. But they developed something rarer and more valuable than friendship, mutual respect. So when Bumpy got that call from Jerome about 3 men planning to kill Malcolm, he didn't hesitate. Some things transcend philosophy, transcend religious differences, transcend everything except the basic human recognition that certain voices can't be allowed to go silent. The phone call Bumpy made that night at 2:47 a.m. wasn't to the police. The NYPD's relationship with both Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X was complicated at best, hostile at worst. Besides, Bumpy had learned long ago that when you needed something handled quietly and efficiently, you handled it yourself. The call was to a man named Albert Chalky Thompson, who ran numbers for Bumpy throughout Upper Manhattan. Chalky was smart, reliable, and more importantly, he commanded respect from street soldiers who could disappear problems without asking unnecessary questions. "Chalky, you awake?" "I am now, Bump. What's the situation?" "I need you to put some eyes on 3 boys who've been talking too much about things that ain't their business. Word is they're planning to make a move on the preacher." There was silence on the other end. Everyone in Harlem knew who the preacher was. Everyone also knew that Bumpy Johnson didn't make requests. He made statements that sounded like requests but carried the weight of commands. "You want them handled permanent-like or just discouraged?" "For now, just watched. But if they so much as sneeze in his direction, I want to know about it before the handkerchief hits the ground. Consider it done." What happened over the next 2 weeks was a masterclass in urban surveillance. Chalky's people were ghosts, shadows that existed at the edges of perception. They watched Thomas Hagen buy ammunition at a sporting goods store in the Bronx. They followed his associates as they scouted the Audubon ballroom where Malcolm was scheduled to speak. They documented meeting times, escape routes, the make and model of getaway cars. But here's where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. On February 13th, exactly 1 day before those 3 men began circling Malcolm's house, Bumpy Johnson did something that went against every instinct he'd developed in 40 years of street warfare. Instead of having Hagen and his crew eliminated quietly, instead of making them disappear into the Hudson River or the foundations of new buildings going up in Queens, he decided to give Malcolm X a choice. That phone call came at 11:23 p.m., interrupting Malcolm as he worked on a speech he'd never get to give. "Minister Malcolm, this is Ellsworth Johnson." Malcolm recognized the voice immediately. He'd heard it in barbershops and restaurants. Always calm, always measured, always carrying an undercurrent of absolute authority. "Mr. Johnson, it's been a while. Not long enough, given why I'm calling. You got 3 men who think they're going to make their bones by putting you in the ground. I can make that problem go away permanently, but I wanted to talk to you first." Malcolm X set down his pen. Outside, snow had begun to fall, each flake visible in the yellow circle of the streetlight outside his window. He'd known this call would come eventually, though not from this source. "What are you asking me, Mr. Johnson?" "I'm asking if you want these boys to wake up tomorrow morning." It was a simple question with profound implications. Malcolm X, the man who'd preached about the coming revolution, who'd talked about freedom by any means necessary, was being offered the ultimate protection by America's most notorious gangster. All he had to do was say yes, and 3 potential assassins would simply cease to exist. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, Malcolm spoke. "I appreciate what you're offering, more than you know, but that's not who I am anymore." "I figured you'd say that." "Respect, Minister, but understand something. I can't watch and protect at the same time. If these boys make their move, I won't be able to stop it. All I can do is make sure they pay for it afterward." "I understand. One more thing. The event on the 21st, at the Audubon. That's when they're planning to move. You might want to consider changing venues." Malcolm X closed his eyes. The Audubon Ballroom had been booked for months. Hundreds of people were planning to attend his speech about the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Changing venues at the last minute would look like cowardice, would undermine everything he'd been trying to build since leaving the Nation of Islam. "I can't do that either, Mr. Johnson, but thank you for the warning." After he hung up, Bumpy Johnson sat in his apartment overlooking Marcus Garvey Park and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He'd offered Malcolm X a way out, offered to solve his problem with the brutal efficiency that had made Bumpy a legend in Harlem. Malcolm had refused, choosing principle over survival. But Bumpy Johnson hadn't survived 4 decades in the most dangerous game in America by accepting other people's choices when those choices led to unnecessary deaths. The next morning, February 14th, Thomas Hagen woke up to find his car wouldn't start. When he popped the hood, he discovered that someone had poured sugar in his gas tank, turning his engine into expensive scrap metal. His 2 associates had similar problems. One found his apartment door superglued shut from the outside. The other discovered that his gun collection had mysteriously disappeared from what he thought was a secure hiding place. But here's the thing about fanatics. Obstacles that would discourage rational people only strengthen their resolve. Instead of taking these warning signs as messages to abandon their plan, Hagen and his crew saw them as tests of their faith. By February 20th, they'd acquired new weapons, new transportation, and a new sense of urgency. The morning of February 21st dawned cold and gray. Malcolm X woke at 5:15 a.m. in his hotel room at the New York Hilton, where he'd moved his family after his house in Queens was firebombed a week earlier. He knew today would be different. He could feel it in the air, in the way the light fell across the carpet, in the unusual quiet of the city streets below. At the Audubon Ballroom, preparations for the afternoon speech were underway. 400 wooden chairs arranged in neat rows, a simple podium on a small stage. Nothing fancy, nothing elaborate. Just a place for a man to stand and speak his truth to anyone willing to listen. What the organizers didn't know was that by 1 p.m., Thomas Hagen and his 2 associates had taken their positions throughout the ballroom. Hagen himself sat in the 3rd row, close enough to ensure accuracy, far enough back to blend with the crowd. His backup shooters were positioned near the exits, ready to create chaos and cover his escape. At 2:30, Malcolm X walked onto that stage for the last time. "Assalamu alaikum," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "Peace be unto you." "Wa alaikumus salamu," the audience responded. For 20 minutes, Malcolm spoke about unity, about the global struggle for human rights, about the need for Black Americans to connect with their African brothers and sisters. His words were powerful, prophetic, tinged with an urgency that suggested he knew his time was running short. Then, at exactly 2:52 p.m., a commotion broke out in the back of the room. "Get your hands out of my pocket," someone shouted. As heads turned toward the disturbance, as Malcolm raised his hands to calm the crowd, Thomas Hagen stood up in the 3rd row, pulled out a sawed-off shotgun, and fired. The first blast hit Malcolm in the chest, spinning him backward against the brick wall behind the podium. As he fell, the 2 backup shooters opened fire with handguns, their bullets finding their target with deadly precision. In less than 15 seconds, it was over. Malcolm X lay dying on the stage of the Audubon Ballroom, his blood pooling beneath him as his wife Betty screamed from the front row and chaos erupted throughout the room. But here's what the history books don't tell you, what most people never learned about those final moments. As Thomas Hagen tried to escape through the crowd, as he pushed toward the exit with his smoking shotgun still in his hands, something extraordinary happened. The crowd didn't part for him. They closed in. See, Bumpy Johnson might not have been able to prevent the assassination, but he hadn't been idle during those final weeks. Word had gone out through Harlem's vast network of street soldiers, numbers runners, and hustlers. Anyone who helped harm Malcolm X would answer personally to Bumpy Johnson. Anyone who helped catch Malcolm X's killers would be rewarded beyond their wildest dreams. As Hagen reached the exit, a man named Reuben Francis tackled him to the ground. The gun went flying. The crowd surrounded him, their anger turning physical, their fists and feet finding their target. By the time the police arrived, Thomas Hagen was barely conscious, beaten so severely he would spend the next 3 weeks in the hospital before standing trial. His 2 associates didn't make it to the door. One was cornered in the balcony, where a group of Malcolm's supporters held him until police could take him into custody. The other tried to blend with the panicking crowd but was identified by 3 different witnesses who'd been specifically told to watch for suspicious behavior. All 3 assassins were in police custody within an hour of the shooting. All 3 would eventually be convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but the real story, the story that never made the newspapers, unfolded in the weeks that followed. At Malcolm X's funeral on February 27th, as tens of thousands of mourners lined the streets of Harlem to pay their respects, Bumpy Johnson stood in the back of the crowd, his head bowed, his face showing an emotion most people had never seen there, genuine grief. After the service, as the crowd dispersed, a young man approached him. It was Jerome, the kid from the diner who'd first reported the assassination plot. "Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry we couldn't stop it." Bumpy looked at him with tired eyes. "Son, sometimes the best you can do is make sure justice gets served. Malcolm knew the risks. He chose to take them because he believed his message was more important than his safety. All we could do was make sure his killers didn't get away with it." "You think it'll make a difference? Catching them, I mean?" Bumpy Johnson was quiet for a long moment, watching as Malcolm's casket was loaded into the hearse that would carry him to his final resting place. Malcolm used to say that if you're not ready to die for something, you're not fit to live for it. Those boys who killed him, they thought they were dying for their cause, but they were really just killing for their own hatred. Malcolm died for something bigger than himself. That's the difference. In the months that followed, something remarkable happened in Harlem. The same street network that Bumpy Johnson had used to track Malcolm's assassins became a protective force for other civil rights leaders who came to speak in the community. Ministers, activists, organizers, they all benefited from an invisible security system run by men who'd never spoken publicly about civil rights, but understood instinctively that certain voices needed to be protected. It wasn't organized. It wasn't official. It was just understood. If you came to Harlem to speak truth to power, to fight for justice, to challenge the system that kept people down, you had friends watching your back whether you knew it or not. Bumpy Johnson never spoke publicly about his role in the events surrounding Malcolm X's assassination. He died in 1968, taking most of his secrets with him. But the people who knew, who understood how the streets really worked, they remembered. They remembered that when it mattered most, when principle and survival came into conflict, when the easy choice was to look the other way and let someone else handle the problem, one of America's most notorious criminals chose to stand with one of America's greatest civil rights leaders. Not because they agreed on religion, not because they agreed on methods, not because they ran in the same circles or shared the same dreams for the future, but because they both understood something fundamental about respect, about dignity, about what it meant to be a man who refused to bow down in a world designed to make you kneel. The lesson here isn't about crime or punishment, about right and wrong in the conventional sense. The lesson is about recognizing greatness, even when it comes wrapped in ideas you don't share, about protecting voices that need to be heard even when they're saying things you don't want to hear. Malcolm X died because fanatics decided his message was too dangerous to survive. But his killers were caught because a gangster understood that some things transcend politics, transcend personal differences, transcend everything except the basic human duty to protect those who speak truth in a world full of lies. Power isn't just about guns or money or territory. Real power is knowing when to use what you have and when to hold back. It's understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do is make a phone call at 2:47 in the morning to save a life, even if you can't save a soul. Bumpy Johnson made that call. He couldn't prevent the assassination, but he ensured that justice was served. In a world where too many crimes go unpunished, where too many killers walk free, that might not seem like much. But ask yourself this: in your world, in your life, when someone's voice needs protecting, when someone's truth needs defending, when the easy choice is to look the other way and let someone else handle the problem, what call will you make? Because the measure of a person isn't whether they agree with you. It's whether they'll stand up for what's right. when standing up costs them something. Even Bumpy Johnson, a man who lived outside the law his entire life, understood that some principles are bigger than personal convenience. The question is, do you?